Hi. So I go by the pen name Pogot, and I've published a novel last year called Fair Weather Brother. And what I hope is probably to just talk about the journey of writing and why I sort of took up fiction writing. So through the course of it, I hope to share some light on it. And in case any questions, happy to take them later.
Just try this one. Okay, it works. I'm Harshad Santosh Pore. I'm an academic, a critic. I'm also a translator, but that's now. I'm an academic first and an academic last. The book that I have translated from Marathi into English is a science fiction aimed at young adults. It's published as The Pursuit of Lilliput. So it's weird I'm including in this session about writing really, but anyway, so translation it is. Yeah.
Good evening, thank you. My name is Dr. Srinivas. I'm a medical doctor, a surgeon, and I've written this book by what I should say default, and I'll tell you why it's on default. Its title is A Tale of Two Homes. It's about building a house in the Nilgiris while a house in Bombay potentially gets demolished. So I shall tell you about that once I get a chance.
So in preparation for this conversation, we've had a few conversations and interactions. What's really stood out for me in this is I started out, very much wearing my social psychological hat, thinking about, okay, why write? What are the motivations you may have, and how might we find common themes and strands to share with the audience? And maybe if some of you are sitting on the fence about writing yourself, then you might have some motivation from there. But the more I've engaged with your personal stories about writing, I feel the best thing that we could do right now is to get into the differences in writing, whether it's translating or it's fiction, or it is narrativized fiction based on life experience. What are your personal motivations for writing? And let's not look for common threads, but just go for the difference in perspective.
Yes. So for me, when I look at fiction writing, and because I've also studied literature, is that I feel that, and this is proven through different articles that I've read previously, is that a lot of our future has been shaped by fiction writing. So whether it's H.G. Wells, whether it's the American Civil War, whether it's even Ambedkar, fiction has the power to influence the future. And what I feel is that we sort of live in a time where, there's a big bunch of climate catastrophe. We're dealing with genetics, that you can pretty much create any food, a baby or an animal. You can probably look at having a diet that you no longer need plants or animals, and robotics that we don't know what it's going to be. And I think that given such a mass of information thrown at us, it's only through a fictional narrative that we can actually understand what we're dealing with. And to give you a very common example is of, for example, a harmless place like Dona Paula, which is very close by over here. I did some research with a couple of taxi drivers when I was writing my book, and what they told me really a crazy story that whenever there's a new Hindi movie release that has a scene of Dona Paula, the location changes to the name of that movie. So it can be Kabhi Haan, Kabhi Na Point, it can be Singham Point, or Badshah Point, whatever it is, but in the sense that somebody else's fiction is becoming our reality. And unless that fiction writing is encouraged in a very positive way to influence the future positively, then there's a high chance that if we don't write, our future will be living in someone else's nightmare.
So you see writing very much as a space from which to take agency into shaping your own place in the future.
Yes, I think something close but not equal to Karl Marx, which is that the idea is just not to understand the world but to change it, and fiction writing has the power to change it.
Great. So activism as a basis for writing, and I think what I've also heard from you is that you very much want to ensure that the story is entertaining and it invites people in, and it's not, you know, not a dense storytelling, but through entertainment working towards social change.
Yes, because I think that the true competition for writing on novels today is Instagram, YouTube, Facebook. And what you're going to see is that the competition is, besides the dead authors that everybody wants to read as classics and claim they read, is that it's either you're competing with dead authors or social media nonsense sort of things. Yeah.
Harsh, do you want to speak now about this?
Okay, it's why write, right? The same question. I hope you're not distracted by the music out there the way I am. In my academic circles at least, I'm popular for giving no-nonsense, kind of cynical, politically incorrect answers. So keeping up with that tradition, I mean, asking why write, this question itself, I find it very hard to take this question seriously, because asking why write is as simple as asking why we breathe, or asking why we wear the kind of clothes we do. To quote Stephen King, and it might be sacrilegious to quote Stephen King at such place instead of quoting maybe Papa Hemingway, but to quote Stephen King, when he was asked, why do you write? And he says, why do you assume I have any other option? So we write because we just write. So that comes first, the urge comes first, and all the ideology, I believe we start building it later. So in my case, if I talk about translation, it was an urge somewhere. The book that I have translated, I read it, it's, by the way, it's targeted towards the early teens, you know, the 5th grader to the 8th grader, something like that. And I picked up that book when I was, I believe, similar age, 12-year-old, something like that. The story stayed with me. It was a Marathi novel, Marathi science fiction novel. The story stayed with me for 10 years, 15 years. And then I realized, hey, why don't the people, the larger audience in India, don't know about this book? And so, hey, let's translate it. You know, it was as simple as that. And of course, translation is one way of really connecting dots of the literature all over the globe. But all these things come later, I believe. It's an impulse that really matters. And it is an impulse that makes you kind of a literary writer or a literally translator, and you're distinguished from the popular writers or the popular kind of artist, because I believe the popular artists put the audience in the forefront. So what does my audience demand? Think about Salman Khan. What do they like? If they want me to remove the shadow, I'm going to do that, right? The other literary ones, the parallel cinema ones, it's the same thing here, and it's my expression first and foremost. If it draws 15 people, I'm fine with that. If it wins an award, fortunately, it's great. But so I think that's the simple answer.
Dr. Srinivas, would you like to read your passage now and then talk about your motivation for it?
Yeah, sure. So let me start with this. Actually, this book, why I wrote this book or whatever it is that we run a homestay in the Nilgiris, you know. And we had some guests who came and stayed there. And they were talking to my wife, you know, how we built this house sitting in Bombay and coming here, and the trials and tribulations, you know, how difficult it was. And then they told her, why don't you write a book on this? Because, you know, such books are not written in India. So she agreed. She happens to be a journalist. She agreed. And after about 3 weeks or 4 weeks, I asked her, what about the book? She said, yeah, it's going to get done. 3 months later, again, I asked her. So that time she snapped. She said, what, do you think writing a book is like surgery? Do you just chop up people and stitch them back together? So I got my answer. I said, since I'm a surgeon, I said, okay, I'll write the book then. If you don't want to write it, I'll write it. So that's how this book came about. And so I was hoping she would take over in the middle. She didn't do that. So I started with an introduction, which I'll just read, and the last page I'll also read. So the introduction says, I have a confession to make. Normally a confession is made on one's deathbed or at the end of the project, but here I'm making it up front. A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens was a masterpiece written by a literary icon. On the other hand, A Tale of Two Homes is a mishmash written by a literary novice. I am a cancer surgeon by profession whose expertise lies in cutting up people and stitching them back together. So much so, I'm the designated tailor at home. My wife is a journalist, but since she was busy, this task of writing this book fell on me. and hence a bit of medical terminology has crept in. As I've only written scientific articles, never attended a creative writing course, nor know the ABC of how to format a story or avoid cliches, this book may be labeled as a piece of junk by the critics. However, in spite of my confession, if you still decide to buy it, please get your paisa vasool, money's worth, as my dear Gujarati friends would say, and at least read the book, and then you have my permission to pass it on to your neighbor at a discount, marketing it as a literary masterpiece. So this is the beginning of the book, and I must, thank you. And the character in the book is the wife, who everybody loves to hate. She's the main character which holds the glue of this book, and but at the end of the book I wrote one sentence, I mean in the acknowledgements, and somebody did mention that I've praised my wife a lot, but anyway, by default, since she didn't want to write the book, this fell in my lap, and my wife has washed her hands of the project and told her journalism students to only read this book so as to ascertain how not to write a novel. So that's what it is.
So as we've been, dabbling in all the touchy topics around writing, around how do people get categorized as popular or literary figures, or what decides which session goes in at what time and which session goes in at which other time, and which session might have a musical interlude which is unwelcome. And all of these other things. I want to get into the subtext quite openly, because I think all of this is very relevant to why write. Even if you may actually occupy the margins of the literary community, as it were. Does having a voice necessarily mean being at the center of it all? Or if it is heard by just one other person, is it still valid?
Because I sort of come from fiction writing, what I would say is that to a large extent, I wouldn't really agree with Stephen King that that it comes naturally. Honestly, I wouldn't really want to be a writer. If there was no sort of oppression, and then if I could just go to a normal job, get home at 5 o'clock and chill out, then I wouldn't write. I mean, I write because I'm upset. So from that perspective, I feel that if you just take a look at a lot of the writers, for example, Frank Kafka, etc., a lot of writers have a tradition of writing with an intent, but never sort of wanting to be out there, or even thought that they would sort of be out there and being relevant even so many years later. And to a large extent, I think that a good writer is something like a doctor. Because when you go to a doctor, you don't sort of go and say, hey, I have a headache, and why don't you give me some medicine? And then doctor says, of course, yeah, you have a headache. Why don't you take a medicine? Because I don't think that's what exactly a doctor does. A doctor analyzes you, whatever you may be thinking. The doctor says, hey, this is not what it really is. What you really want to have a look at is this report, and this is what it is. And so in that case, I seem like a good writer, like a good doctor, does a good analysis of the situation, tells you what you're up against, and in some way either kicks you or pushes you into the unknown that you're slightly braver to confront, or even to stand up and acknowledge in some way. So in that sense, it's not really important to be popular. If it happens, what the heck. But the real thing is to be true to yourself and tell the story that you think is going to make a difference.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
The bit about all the elitism, or the ins and the outs and the margins.
Okay, the things we were discussing. So sitting out there in the launch, we were discussing these things, the elitism of literature festivals. And I hope nobody from the organizers is here, otherwise I wouldn't be invited next time. I believe there is quite a lot of elitism, and I'm particularly, despite being a critic, despite being a teacher of literature, and I'm supposed to be the perpetrator of this tradition, separating something like high literature from the popular literature, but I'm completely against this tradition. In fact, the dichotomy of literature versus popular fiction, which if you have been here for the last 2 days, you can sense it all over. And I think it's a classist system we are creating, while at the same time putting up a mask and trying to be iconoclastic about certain things, but creating another class of our own. And it's very hypocritical in a way, I believe. Yeah, and from what he said, what a good writer is, I believe a good writer is the one whose book, if you pick up, I think you can, and pick it up willingly, I think you can finish reading it. Because in personal conversations, over a pint of beer, my very dear professor who taught us Salman Rushdie admitted to me that, Harshad, I could never finish reading Midnight Children beyond 50 pages, you know. I mean, Abhay, he is a great writer nevertheless. And I believe that is somewhere is a failure of a writer. I mean, of course he will win awards, and if there is a fatwa on you, the chances increase apparently. But I believe a good writer is the one who you can finish reading. I think there is the first test of good writing. It's as simple as that.
Well, so writing this book, you know, the problem is being a doctor in medical college, you got so many big textbooks, so you don't have time to read books. You read all these small thin books, James Hadley Chase, and all these time pass books. So I don't read heavy literature. So my book is like that, it's just small chapters. And what used to happen is during the morning when I go for a walk, I'll think of something, and then my attention span is very short, so the chapter is very short. So the book has multiple chapters, about 80. So the problem is, the thing is, once you write a book, how do you get it out to the public? How do they know about it? Especially since the big publishing houses won't look at unknown authors. And so my book fortunately went to some bookstores, and as my wife says, all your patients keep buying your book. And the reason they buy it is because I'm a urological cancer surgeon. And when they're on the operating table, I tell them, if you don't buy the book, something wrong will be cut off. So that's what happened.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add to that, and in terms of the term used, like for example, being a certain classes in terms of at certain literature festivals, etc. And firstly, what I do enjoy over here is that you do get a different flavor to the writers, because I feel that this is honestly the first festival I've attended, and what I feel is that in most popular writing, whether it's that is popular at a big festival by literally agents or publishing houses, tend to have a certain angle that they try to peddle. And one of them is very common is that, praising India's past, praising the British Raj in India, or anything that sort of drives you onto the neoliberalism path. So in that sense, you find a lot of books that speak that language, get that sort of an audience. And I think that if you're not part of that bandwagon, then life becomes even more difficult, because you're preaching in a different way anti-consumerism in the form of novel writing. So in that sense, I feel that the journey becomes even tougher. And it takes, I would say, more than what I've heard of people who have been successful in this line is probably 10 to 12 years before people actually get to know you, actually read you, or anything like that. So it's quite a long path. It's pretty much nobody along with you besides you telling yourself that you want to write.
Dr. Srinivas, you make it sound very matter of fact that you just took up this writing project. I wanted to ask you whether there were any, of course your wife's judgment and the humor in it is also there, but did you have any niggling doubts about how this would shape up, or what was it like to put it out there after all your academic publication? This would have a very different flavor.
Yeah, absolutely. But the thing is, since I've written only medical and scientific articles before, this is a completely different field. So the only thing I did is at the beginning I made a few points of what to write. And like I said, I was hoping she'll take over the book after a few chapters, but she didn't do it, so I had to continue it. So my writing style was like every morning when I went for a walk, I'd think of what to write in that chapter. in the afternoon when I come home for about 2 hours, just type out that thing, finish that chapter, and read the previous one and go ahead. So it took me about 2 months to write it. Then, of course, people say you got to keep editing it and rewriting it and all that. And that's what my wife said because, like I told you, she's a journalist. So I told her, I'm a surgeon. We chop up one person once, we stitch them up. We don't go back and fiddle around. So I didn't do anything more to it. I just went and bunged it in. Let's see what happens. People have read it and many of them like it. The average person, I don't know about the high literary pundits.
Okay, if I want to add something to that, you shouldn't have said it took you 2 months to, sorry, was that a mistake? You said 2 months? Yeah. You should have said 10 years, it increases the value of the book somehow.
I don't have 10 years more to live.
Although you write just 1 chapter per year, saying 10 years is something adds value to your book. I think discussing the difficulties in writing or difficulties in translating can be such an interesting thing. And somebody just mentioned that somewhere, so I'm just drawing on that. For me as a translator, I found it, and if somebody has attempted translation, tell me whether you relate to this. It was so difficult to find the translator's voice. I mean, we often talk about finding the writer's voice, and you try maybe multiple books and multiple genres, and at some point you hit that sweet spot, okay, and this is what I'm going to write. But I found it so difficult to find the translator's voice because translation can be taken as a new writing on its own. Translation unfortunately doesn't get so much respect as it deserves, because although you're drawing onto a book which has already been there, for your target readers, it's a new book that you write, right? They are not aware of the original text, or maybe they are unable to read the original text, and that's why they follow on the translation. So while my book was marketed towards the, as I said, 5th to the 8th graders, my biggest challenge I faced was the original book can be read well by that audience. Can my translation also be read equally well by that audience? I mean, I believe the people who are translating the mainstream books marketed at the general audience, the adults, I don't believe they face this problem. So this is the problem I never thought I would face, and that was a big challenge. And even today, after getting the book published, I'm not very sure whether I have surmounted that challenge somehow. I believe that's for the readers to decide. That was quite a tricky area.
And I think an interesting note to share about editing is the notes of Hemingway. And it's quite interesting to mention Hemingway because he has also been accused of a writer who's never sent any reader to the dictionary. So in that case, he's quite different from the regular writers who sort of keep sending you to the dictionary, but he's a sort of bestseller who's won the Nobel Prize and probably would never send you there. But how he approaches it is that he says that for a lot of his novels, he's probably rewritten the last chapter more than 67 times in order to get the drama that he's looking at. So in the sense, if you read something and you think that it's absolutely smooth, then it's pretty much the writer sort of hammering and almost tormenting those words and those lines to sort of have a certain flow or direction. So in many ways, it's like you're rewriting the whole thing all over again. So I think without editing and the painful take of it, because for me, I think it took almost a year and a half to go through the whole process of it. And when I read it now, I still feel that I could be sharper on this point or that point.
Nowadays, with the variety of options available for publishing, and what's self-publishing, but also people who market themselves as publishers, but they are termed vanity publishers. So you can almost approach someone to say, will you publish this book for me, because I don't want to self-publish. The market for different writing styles has opened up, and as has the variety of readers who are opting to read. What has been your experience of picking up a book, or what are the kinds of books that you yourself find yourself getting drawn to?
So an interesting note, since we spoke about earlier as well as self-publishing, And so in the sense of in the publishing space, because I do have a couple of friends in certain book houses, and they pretty much told me the whole process. Check. Sure, yeah. So one of the things that they shared was that every publisher has around a year ahead to print. So you sort of fall into queue. The second piece about it is that your story will be sort of bent and narrated to a point that they feel inclined, or given their readership that they want to be inclined towards. So, and the biggest part is that I feel that if you're paid for your work, then you tend to work in the direction of your employer. So my suggestion would be is that to go absolutely for the self-published route, do the day job, save in the money, publish it yourself. You have absolutely the literary freedom to say and write how you want to do it. No one's going to stop you. And that in itself is a testament to what you want to put out there. But the moment somebody pays you to do something, it's pretty much somebody owns your voice, and that's pretty much what it's going to turn out to be. So that's something that I would advise with go for self-publishing.
Okay, talking about the publishing industry, that's quite an interesting topic. And I remember while I was still a student, the first research paper I did was the comparison of publishing industry in Marathi and in English. And although I believe that classicism is kind of problematic, the hierarchy that we have in the publishing industry, I believe it is in a way necessary. I mean, think about this. You can just publish a book on Kindle these days, and that by no way reduces the value of your book. Ideally, it shouldn't, because that is a revolt kind of against the establishment. So it gives a very powerful tool in the hands of the author to self-publish the book. And of course, but I believe self-publishing revolution is kind of dying in a way, because when Kindle started in 2012 and 2013, and we started seeing those Kindle millionaires or the self-published millionaires in either way, either they have sold 1 million copies of their books, which was a revolution in itself, or the people who became millionaire authors in dollar terms by selling, I don't know, maybe 5 million copies of their books. That was a revolution in itself, and I believe that was quite necessary. And publishing industry, the mainstream industry, did change their publishing practices after that. Some of them strictly picked up the books that came via literary agents, and now they have the things on their website. You can directly submit the works, things like that. Okay, they are trying to source for new and fresh voices, but still, I believe somewhere the hierarchy is quite important, because a self-published author versus an author published by a traditional publishing house, or a small traditional publishing house versus maybe one of the big six, Penguin, HarperCollins, Random House, and the people like that, or the one published by Penguin versus the one published by maybe Oxford University Press, and I don't believe you can bundle them, all of them together. And I'm not saying this from the writer's point of view, I'm saying this from the reader's point of view. When a reader, it's like going to this restaurant, it's by a more popular brand, so I know I'm going to get a particular quality taste in my food, versus going to that roadside dhaba, I may like it, it might be great, it might be spicy and tangy, but it's a risk I'm taking. So I believe certain kind of hierarchy that the establishment has created, and we try to break it, but I believe that is in a way important, and I don't see that going away anytime soon.
I found quite a difference, in getting medical articles published and getting a book published. For in the simple sense, when you send an article to any journal abroad or an international journal, they have the courtesy to write back to you and say, okay, we've received the article. Few weeks later, they may write back and say, okay, we've rejected it, or we want it changed, certain thing, or we have accepted it. Whereas you send any article to these publishing houses, anywhere, nobody bothers about it. It's in the trash can. And you can be sitting there for 6 months, 8 months, 9 months, waiting for a reply. You never get it. You only get a reply if you're some big shot, So I feel, unless you're some top shot politician or a film star who is writing a story, or a cricketer, or some really big author. But otherwise, getting it published in a big publishing house is really difficult in a practical point of view. And so that's why the self-publishing route has sort of caught up. You can get a book published the way you want, and sometimes when you send it to these big houses, they want it chopped and cut the way they want. Here you write what you want. And then the main thing is marketing your book. Who's going to buy a book? Who's going to read it? And even if you get it published by the big publishing houses, they may push a few books, but the rest of the books are put at the back of the bookstore. It may not go forward. So to get the audience to read it, it's a different ball game altogether.
I will believe Chetan Bhagat is the guy who can be credited for revolutionizing Indian publishing industry. So that was the first author we have seen who sold millions of copies without trying too hard to do that. Somehow he just hit that sweet spot with the readers. And after that, we saw this crop of writers. All of them wrote in the same genre, which was chick lit, written by men. And a lot of them, after Chetan Bhagat was published by Rupa, a reputed publishing house, but after that, all those authors who came were published by a small publishing house called Srishti Publication. And the Srishti Publication, at least at that time, didn't have a website or anything, and nobody knew how to approach that. I don't know how these authors approached them. But once they sold, I don't know, maybe 50,000 copies, a couple of lakh copies, I have seen all these authors. Their second book was by Penguin, and the third book was by HarperCollins. So, I mean, I can understand it from the publishing house's point of view. You want to stay afloat, it's a business you're running, and you want the author to sell a particular number of copies. So they look, if you're a celebrity already or well-known in your field due to some reason, it does increase your chances of getting a book published.
So, in terms of, I'd like to share a story regarding a book called On the Road by a writer called Jack Kerouac. And it's sort of important because he's probably called like the grandfather of hippies, because his book On the Road sort of led to the hippie revolution. And probably Goa is Goa because of, you know, whatever happened down the line. But it's important to note that when he wrote the book, it took him close to 8 years to get it published. And I say this because to a large extent, we don't really realize how dangerous writers can be. Because a book has a tendency that can change an entire generation. And very true to this book in the sense that a lot of the literary houses rejected it. It wasn't getting published. The writer almost went mad. I think that the delay in getting his book published led to his, life into alcoholism, and ultimately he died. So what I'm trying to say is that it was a book that was rejected by the literary class because it was anti-establishment. It took a long time, and when it did get published, it changed the whole world. And I think that in yeah, I'm just killing all the mics. Okay, so in that sense, I believe that not having a censor in a large way is highly empowering. And that's something, since we have the opportunity with all the social media platforms and everything, it's something that we should sort of absolutely go for it. And, and almost like, it doesn't really matter who thinks what, as long as I believe On the Road had a message. It's not really a right book, it's not pure, it's not, it's absolutely wrong from a male chauvinistic perspective. But that being said, in the sense that I think that if Kerouac had the power to self-publish, he probably would have been alive longer than he was. Yeah.
Great. So I feel we've really explored the edges of the question of why write. I think it's a political and emotional subject. There's a whole writing industry, and there are different takes you can have on it in terms of how you engage with it and how you consume it, how you produce for it, and how you get engagement from the audiences. And from my perspective, being in conversation with all three of you, it's been really in a way grounding to see that you can hold very different positions in equally entrenched ways, and at the same time, when you write, who picks it up is totally beyond your control, and it might shift their perspective. So with that, the formal part of this conversation is done, but I believe we have about 3 minutes for questions, 3 to 5 minutes. So if anyone would like to ask a question.